This episode is brought to you by Audi. The road is calling. Embrace the thrill of the drive with the all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron. Featuring effortless power, serious acceleration, and advanced Audi tech. It's not just a new EV, it's a new way to experience driving. The all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron is here. The next chapter of Audi starts now.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Hello out there. I'm Ross Kenyon. I'm a climate tech and carbon removal entrepreneur and the host of the Reversing Climate Change podcast. If you're listening and you're a fan of the show, could I please call on you to become a subscriber? It's $5 a month, keeps this show financially viable, and gets you access to ad-free listening, bonus content, and potentially more as I build out the offerings. Link is in the show notes, and now begins the show intro. Hello out there. I'm Ross Kenyon. I'm a climate tech and carbon removal entrepreneur and the host of the Reversing Climate Change podcast. If you're listening and you're a fan of the show, could I please call on you to become a subscriber? It's only $5 a month. It helps keep the show financially viable, and it gets you access to ad-free listening, bonus content, and potentially more as I build out the subscriber offerings. The link is in the show notes, and now begins the show intro. Today I have a show for you that I've wanted to make for a very long time. When I feel like enjoying some alcohol, which isn't wildly often, I prefer an amaro spritz. Today I have a show for you that I've wanted to make for a very long time. When I feel like enjoying some alcohol, which isn't wildly often, I prefer an amaro spritz. I like that it's less alcoholic, it's effervescent, it's strange. Amaro, the singular in Italian, or amari, the plural, means bitter in Italian. The taxonomy here gets a little confusing. They're not like bitters that you think of like Angostura in a small bottle where it's very concentrated. And then there's also differences between amari, digestifs, aperitifs, and also Italian bitters like Campari, which is technically not an amaro in my understanding. But the line between all of these categories is a bit blurry. But one thing you can say is that they're often strange, medicinal, earthy. Sometimes they're sweet like Aperol, but they often have a bit of a funk to them. They're not normal. And that's the fun of it. They go back centuries. I think of them as being herbally infused liquors or wines, and I associate them very strongly with strange little liquors, strange little drinks from Italian villages. And I know this isn't always technically how it works, but I imagine them as being made in the same way with the same recipe for hundreds of years and being extremely local, not typically an exported type of beverage, but something that maybe is just a passion of the local people there. This has changed over time where some varieties of Italian bitters and amari have become worldwide phenomena. Is there a bar that you couldn't get an Aperol spritz at in the summer? It's increasingly common. People enjoy things like Negronis, which with the Campari focus are a strange beverage. It's bright red and it's not a straightforwardly sweet drink. There's a lot of complexity to it. It's just odd. And they're all like this, essentially. Some of them are pretty sweet. Like I had an Amaro Montenegro in a drink recently, and that was pretty sweet. But oftentimes you'll have them all the way from something like Malort, which we talk about in this show, which is famously associated with Chicago as a rather aggressive drink. There's a beer bar near me that has these on the counter. Underberg, which is a digestif drink that I guess it's a German thing that people will often drink after a meal. There's all sorts of these bizarre little drinks where it's actually pretty difficult to pick out a specific flavor and say, oh, this is definitely what that is. There's some exceptions, something like nocino, It's walnut based, and some of these drinks that are pretty straightforward, they just have a single ingredient or they focus on a specific featured ingredient, but some of them are secretive. Chartreuse is a very famous example of this where, as far as I know, this might be marketing. I don't even know if it's true, but there's a couple monks that know what goes into chartreuse. And when one of them dies, someone else is brought into the arcane mysteries of what makes chartreuse. And that's fun. I like the mythology of that. I think that's a really cool thing in a world where everything feels very corporate and more of these flavors become synthetic. I think it's nice to have something that just feels mysterious and earthy. And even if it's not always technically true, I kind of like that a little bit. That's nice. So anyways, they're not straightforwardly pleasant drinks. They often have a medicinal, woody, earthy, herbal component. I don't think of them as having a very straightforward flavor. If you drink them, it's unclear what is happening in them. There's also flavors that maybe you don't really know or couldn't pull out, like gentian root, which is in a lot of these too, or quinine bark. A lot of these drinks have a medicinal intention. I associate them also very strongly with, and this is the bad version, snake oil salesmen and patent medicine in the 19th century. I think of traveling hucksters hawking suspicious vials of quite alcoholic concoctions mixed with herbs. You'll even see this now too. If you know anyone who's an herbalist, and one of the techniques that's very famous in herbalism is making tinctures, which is submerging various types of ingredients in alcohol, and alcohol will pull that out of it. If you've ever made, this is also an example, I'm not even sure if this technically counts as amaro, which is where this becomes blurred, but if you've ever made or consumed limoncello, it's also the case where you mix various types of citrus with Everclear, if you can get it, and just pure grain alcohol, and you end up diluting it later. But that alcohol is a very effective way of pulling flavor out of organic ingredients like that, and then you later dilute it. But a lot of these drinks started as medicine, so they have this sort of extractive component, pulling the nutrients out of various types of herbs with the intention of settling the stomach or curing some ailment. And it has that medicinal heritage to it. And only to make the line more unclear, there are also drinks like gin, basically vodka that has been infused with various types of herbs and plants. Specifically, gin is famous for juniper. But there's a lot else that ends up mixed in there too. And so as you're probably understanding from this category, even though I've been very flexible in defining it, even to the point where I'm talking about gin, which is not an amaro, they're highly idiosyncratic. And also there's a connection here with vermouth, which is considered a type of aromatized wine, which means it's wine and mixes in sugar and herbs and various other ingredients to change the flavor of it. A lot of these ingredients are strange. They're not necessarily always the most commonly found. Imagine some of them probably grow in microclimates where those ranges might be changing, and some of them further worse. I imagine the ones that are dependent upon the European Alps are going to become progressively harder to find as the climates along the mountains shift upwards as the climate warms. And we're going to lose access or potentially see that shrink. So one of the things that we talk about in this show is to what degree amari are going to adapt to the changing flavors that are even available to us, and to what degree that's going to be synthetically recreated. And what do we lose when we lose some of that, natural variability and end up with an extract flavor that's dependable, but maybe doesn't have that spark of inspiration that we really look for when we want something that's special and unique. And if you're seeking out a bottle like this, I think it's not because you want always something that's exactly the same every time. I think it's because you want something that's special. And I certainly feel that way. I don't even really necessarily mind if some of these bottles change in the same way that you expect wine to change over the duration of ownership. But we've also come to expect liquor, with a possible exception of wine, which gets better over time up to a point, and beer, which gets worse up to a point until it skunks and is no longer drinkable. We sort of expect a lot of harder liquor to just be shelf stable and hang in there. For the most part, that's true. But as we talk about in this show, it's really more complicated than that. So I'm very glad to bring on Shanna Farrell today on the podcast. She's an oral historian at Berkeley, a former bartender, and author of A Good Drink in Search of Sustainable Spirits. I learned a lot from this book, and I imagine you will too. It's a good one. You should pick it up and read it. I also read a couple other books in the researching of this show. I read Crushed by Brian Friedman. It's a very good book as well. And I've also enjoyed the writing of Brad Thomas Parsons and Amy Stewart. It's a highly specialized topic, and a lot of the manufacturers of these drinks are not sharing their procurement with a lot of people. One of the themes that we talk about in the show is that because of the way this is regulated, especially in the US, there isn't strong regulation around sharing which ingredients make it into liquor. And that means that we don't actually know a lot of times, unless they're publishing recipes, which oftentimes they're not, because these recipes are proprietary and they want to keep them that way. So we don't actually know, which makes it hard to have a topic like this explored to my full satisfaction. So we start to scratch this itch, but there's still a lot more to say about this. I care about this topic a lot. Somehow I know more about this than I maybe thought I did going into it. Just I'm able to mostly freestyle off of the various differences in drinks and how they're made and the ingredients. In any case, thank you so much for being with me, Shanna. I'm really glad you've written on this topic. I hope you'll write more in the future. And I think it's going to become increasingly relevant as climate change progresses and some of the ingredients that we maybe take for granted in these strange bottles become harder and harder to find or increasingly synthetic. So thank you so much for being here with me. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the show.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast here to tell you about Michelob Ultra Courtside. It's getting fans closer to the NBA with a chance to win prizes like courtside seats, a trip to All-Star Weekend, and much more. Check it out at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access, Courtside 24-25 sweepstakes, no purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 and up. Begins on October 1st, 2024, ends July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit MichelobUltra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
Well, Shanna, thanks so much for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed your book, A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits. I feel like everyone assumes alcohol is bad, so no one really cares about this. They just assume that it's bad or never thought about it. Do you agree with that? Is that how it feels?
You know, I think that there's a lot of reasons that people don't apply the same principles of sustainability and agriculture to spirits as they do other things. And I do think that nothing exists in a vacuum. And prohibition plays a role in this. And alcohol is a type of poison, but I enjoy consuming it. It still gets consumed a lot. And so we still have to think about these things.
Wow. You threw out so much bait there in that one small paragraph. Wait, what does prohibition have to do with the fact that people don't care about the sustainability of alcohol?
Well, I think what you were saying before about how people assume alcohol is bad, that's where that comes from. It was villainized for so long. And then it took a very long time for things to recover after prohibition. And so the villainization of it gets repeated over and over again. And I think, I'll leave it there for now. I'm going to just go off on a tangent otherwise. So
tangents are welcome. Wait, so it's simultaneously a poison, but also not an inherently bad poison? Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, I think that moderation is key, right? That's the thing. And I think also, too, if you just enjoy a cocktail every once in a while and, have a drink once a year, once a month, it still matters where these things come from because it is a huge global industry. I might not necessarily, let's say, I'm trying to think of an example of something that doesn't feel immediately relevant to me because it's not part of my everyday life, but I still have to care about it, right? Because it affects the planet and our local ecosystems and that kind of thing.
I think it's even possible to care about it beyond the more abstract environmental sustainability reasons, where some of the stories in the book, just learning what goes into something like Campari is pretty spooky. I'm like, okay, I'm going to choose different Italian bitters from now on because I don't know that I want to consume some of the things that are added to these beverages.
Well, I did look it up the other day, and Campari no longer uses some of the synthetic dyes, so they have made some changes.
Oh, that's good to hear. Okay, that's nice.
I'm not sure if anyone there read my book, and that's why, but
Let's hope so.
they've changed their recipe multiple times over the years, so.
Huh. But also you wouldn't know from reading the label because for some reason spirits just do not require to list ingredients on them. I'm not even sure why that is.
Yeah, that actually goes back to Prohibition as well. So before Prohibition, alcohol was regulated on a federal level. When Prohibition got repealed, it went to states. So that's why the 3-tier system, or essentially how it goes from producer to retailer to consumer, how that changes based on what state you live in. And that after Prohibition got repealed, I want to say I'm 95% sure that the FDA did not exist then when Prohibition was repealed, but it went to the TTB. So now it's regulated under basically the tax bureau.
Okay. Wouldn't have expected that. I mean, I've certainly bought liquor through, the first thing I think of is what does it even call? Is it ABCs? What's it called in Virginia?
Yeah. ABC. Yeah.
I've been there before, and I've also heard rumors of just how tightly regulated it is for like intermediaries or distributors of alcohol too. It's very tight in my understanding.
Yeah, I think that the 3-tier system was put into place originally to try to balance out which stakeholder had most of the power. And so that's why it is different per state, but the way things shift and evolve over time certainly change. And it's easier in New York State to do some of these things, like selling directly from a producer to a consumer, than it is in a place like California where you have to go through a retailer. So, and it is different between wine, beer, and spirits as well. So not all alcohol is regulated the same.
How much do these regulations actually protect people, and how much of them maybe just look like it?
I don't think they protect people at all. Okay. So I would say
I asked that in a nice neutral way, but you did.
Yeah, no, I know. I don't think they were put into place to protect people at all. I think that they were put in place to try to check some power, but it got shifted in other places. And before Prohibition too, there's Kings County Distillery, one of the founders wrote a book that I'm blanking on the title of, but it's one of my favorite books about whiskey history. And there's some theories that I've kind of pulled from that book a little bit or was inspired by from that book. And that I think that Prohibition was largely because the people were losing out on money. Like the federal government was losing out on money. And so Prohibition was a way of, from a federal perspective, trying to get some of that money. I mean, you think about the cannabis industry and it's sort of similar in that way. There's some parallels to be made, I think, between the two. So I think it was meant to protect the government and not the actual consumers.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I don't know enough about it, but I can't say it would entirely surprise me. Well, I'd like to talk about some of the various spirits here. You tell stories of several of them in your book. I think one of the ones that caught my ear the most is the one about bourbon. One, I think people don't really know the history of bourbon that well, or they think they do, but they're leaving out major parts of the story. But also a lot of it, even the fancy brands end up just using a commodity like grain alcohol cellar, essentially, where it sounds, maybe they put some nice finishings on it and have their touch on the process, but the bulk of it is not what you'd expect from a more artisanal producer. Thanks for ruining that for me, but also now I have a better understanding of what I should be buying and thinking about moving forward.
So it's hard to, to make a grand sweeping statement. Majority of the whiskey industry does, there are not producers who basically have their own farms. They're few and far between. A few do, but the vast majority do not. So they have to source their grain from somewhere. And oftentimes, I've been on distillery tours in Kentucky on the Bourbon Trail, and I've said, "Where does your grain come from?" I've asked that question. And the person is like, "I don't know, one of the square states in that direction." So they just have no idea even what state it comes from. They are getting their grain. A lot of distilleries get their own grain, and then they cook it and ferment it and make the whiskey. But a lot of places do source that alcohol, and then they put it in barrels and they finish it essentially. And I think if you're on a distillery tour or you're at a retail store asking the question of like, hey, do they distill their own whiskey or do they source it, is a good question. And most of the time there is disclosure about that. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are a lot of people who are doing really wonderful things and really forward thinking. And especially since my book came out, I have had people contact me and say like, hey, I'm working on this little project here, or I'm starting this distillery and I'm really making an effort to make sure I'm using locally sourced grain and I have a direct relationship with the growers of the grain. So there's more of that happening now, and it's really inspiring. So, but I mean, in general, wheat is, yes, a commodity crop.
I just have a suspicion, especially when I'm buying from a larger brand that is reliant upon the commodity system to some extent. I also think about this where, all right, I am very susceptible to this idea of amari as having like each individual amaro being produced by some weird little Italian village. It's been there for hundreds of years. They have their, and then if you dig into it a little bit, you're like, oh, it's owned by one of the major beverage manufacturers and it's all synthesized at this point. It's no longer just a weird little special thing. I don't even know if that's true. Is that even the correct assumption that I should have going into drinking?
I don't know that that's completely true.
Oh, that's good. Please disabuse me of it.
In Europe, there are still a lot of grower producers that are around. And in order to get more international distribution, they work with the big companies. So a lot of them still make their own products, but just in terms of how the like logistics of it work, they do work. They're maybe owned by larger companies and they distribute it for them. But a lot of places, especially in Europe, still are small grower producers. Some things are synthetic, and again, this goes back to the fact that alcohol is not regulated by the FDA, so they don't have to have ingredients listings on bottles, so we might never know where things are coming from, and if there are synthetic chemicals in there or synthetic ingredients. But it's not, I wouldn't say that that's the whole story. I think there's a lot of people still doing some good stuff.
Is there any way to know as a consumer when you're supporting one over another?
Yeah, I think that now with the internet, there's a lot of producers that have websites. And so you can Google it and you can try to find out. There's a lot of writers who are doing some interesting kind of travel pieces with visiting these places. And so I think if you just, do an internet search of the producer to see if they're making it or if it's going somewhere else, you can tell a lot from a website.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no matter how many smoke and mirrors they put up, I think if you get below the surface, you can kind of figure it out. And some if you're really looking at an obscure one, they might not have a website, and that could actually be a good thing. So both directions there.
Yeah, interesting way to do the detective work. I think a year ago I got a bottle of Di Serono to bake with and to make some nice nutty almondy pastries. And after reading your book, I had this moment. I'm like, please tell me this is not one of the bad ones. And I asked ChatGPT, and I don't know if it's true, but it assured me that this is not fake almond flavor. You're good. I'm
not 100%. I'm not familiar with the Di Serono products, but yeah, sometimes those nut flavors are synthetic.
Yeah. It did freak me out enough though, where I'm like, is it so hard to make something that is authentically good? Have we not lost all the taste buds where we want the strange and the non-clear chemical taste? Why not?
Yeah, I think that there's a bit of a turn from that too. People are realizing, oh, I want something that I can get locally, or there's a story. I mean, I'm local to St. George Spirits, and they make eau de vies, and you can, you visit the distillery and you see all the pears on the distillery floor, and you can smell them when it's pear season. And so that they're using fresh, real ingredients. And the same thing, I think, when you go to Leopold Brothers, they make a lot of liqueurs, and they get most things from Colorado in a smaller footprint. And so you can, go visit and see the fruit that's actually there. And so I think that there are people who are still making things from actual products. Small Hand Foods does that. I think they're still around, but they, like the Orgeat, it's nothing synthetic.
Do you think it's at all like how it is for natural winemaking, where I think people assume there's some variability in using more natural products, where sometimes the wine is really great and sometimes it's undrinkable? I've certainly had bottles where I'm like, is it not better to just, like, I think Barefoot would be better than this bottle, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, living in the Bay Area, natural wine is it's like imbued in the fabric of the culture here. And I have definitely had some natural wines that I'm like, maybe this needed a little more time. But I've had some that are great as well. I think it's different with spirits because they're distilled. So some of that does make it a little bit more uniform, but I would argue what's wrong with having a bottle of eau de vie taste different year to year, or a bottle of whiskey that has different corn in it that has been grown from different places. I think that with alcohol, we've sort of gotten used to this idea that everything should taste the same all the time. And with wine, it's part of it's always been part of the conversation, which vintage tastes different or which methods taste different. And so that's just sort of how people have always talked about wine. But with hard alcohol, it's like, well, how come this isn't consistent? And so I think applying some of those same ideas that are just part of the wine culture to spirits makes a lot of sense because they're both from agricultural products.
Wow, that's really fascinating. The only counterexample I can think of that is barely even a counterexample is, scotches will say like 14 years, but it doesn't list which year that started in, which like wine does. They'll say it's like 2017. I don't know. Why don't they do that?
That's a good question. Some do, I think. Or like when they're barreled. And so how long that they're aged for. And sometimes that's, to be completely honest, in Europe, I'm not as familiar with some of the rules that govern how the labeling works. But I do know in the US, I think that there are age statements that are required. So,
yeah, I wonder how much of that is just governed in Europe by the DOPs and DOCs and just.
Yeah. And I don't know that Scotch. Is that right? I'm not 100% sure. Scotch may have a DOC.
If not, they're extremely protective over it. In America, you have to call it single malt here, right? I don't even think you can call it even like.
It's like American single malt, yeah.
Yeah, like
you can't call it Scotch, but I think you can call it single malt.
I think that's how they do it. Yeah. We should start back at your story. Actually, we skipped ahead. I have you here, so I dove right into asking all my questions. I'm sure there's a dozen more waiting close behind it, but. Maybe you could tell us how you got into this topic. It's not the most natural topic, I think, for a lot of people to dive into at this depth.
Yeah. So there was like a confluence of things, or an amalgamation of different experiences coming together, I would say. But I was really interested in environmental issues, let's say, when I was in high school. I grew up on along the Hudson River in an area that was really polluted. The Hudson River is actually the largest Superfund site in the United States. And I grew up kind of in the area where the source of the pollution came from. And I was in high school when there were a lot of fights around, do we clean it up or do we not? And so I got up really close, and I used to go to town meetings, and I used to go to town meetings, and I was really interested in this topic because it was pretty nuanced, but in many ways it was nuanced, in many ways it was not. And so when I kind of fast forward to when I was in graduate school, I was really interested in the way water affects communities in different ways. And so I'm an oral historian full time at UC Berkeley, and I was getting a master's degree in oral history, and I was kind of studying the Hudson River and how this was like, what this was happening. I was really interested in actually how water affects alcohol and spirits and that kind of thing, because also too, if you travel to different places, water tastes different. And so I'm endlessly fascinated by water. And originally this book was going to be about water, but it was way too niche and I couldn't find anyone to publish that version of it.
Wow.
And so I was also bartending to put myself through graduate school, and I tell the story at the beginning of the book, but there was a producer whose label was, they made whiskey and it said it was New York State grain. And I thought that was really interesting. It was the first time I had seen a company like right up front say, this is New York State grain. Also, it was a very eye-catching label. And it was also some of our like most expensive stuff. So I was like naturally drawn and interested in this. And so when I was getting my graduate degree, I was doing an oral history project, and they're kind of on, the distillery is on property that's like just off the Hudson River. So it's like, maybe I can see if I can interview this distiller as part of my graduate work. And my advisor was like, yeah, that's a great idea. So I ended up talking to them, and the distillery has since switched owners. And so, the original owner had said, it was kind of a cost thing, and was like, I could save a lot of money if I just create a direct relationship with a grain grower. So why don't I do that? So he was able to do that. And then he was also pretty instrumental in changing some of the state laws so you could actually, sample your product at a farmer's market or something like that. So kind of to fit in with some of the farmer's market rules. And so I was like, it just really opened my eyes to what was possible. And then fast forward years later, well, I guess it was a few years later, it wasn't a lot. I'm now living in San Francisco, and this is kind of controversial to say, but I feel like California is a little bit of ahead, like maybe a couple years ahead of the food culture in New York. And
probably is controversial.
Yeah, but I strongly believe that a lot of trends that are happening here, you kind of see happen later there. But listing what farms different ingredients come from, or how fish were caught, that kind of thing. It's really common here. And I would be seeing these things. So I was like getting more and more interested in like, okay, you have a vegan restaurant and you say that you have a vegan bar, but I also know that the stuff on your back bar isn't vegan. So there's a huge disconnect here. Or restaurants that are like, oh, we are totally organic, we're farm to table. The same things we're not applying to the bar. You go into renowned restaurants who are known for these things, and then you see a bottle full of dye and synthetic flavors on the back bar, and you're like, well, you're not paying as much attention to the bar, and bars are the profit center of restaurants. So I don't know. I just like that. I think there's a disconnect there as well. And so I don't know. I just kind of got deeper and deeper into this, and here we are.
Be nice if the bars at these restaurants did have more artisanal bottles available, but I also noticed that even for something that I imagine some of the ingredients in some drinks are well, and some of them are more premium, but it almost doesn't matter. It's hard to get a cocktail for seemingly under what a meal costs a lot of places too. So how much would it cost to just get all of the local artisanal production going?
I mean, that's changed so much, and there's a lot of economic reasons that I not being a bar owner or bar manager at this point, like I can't necessarily comment on super intelligently, but like prices of everything have gone up. It's just so alcohol prices have gone up. I think COVID had a big impact on a lot of this stuff. People are still trying to make up costs lost from that. Yeah, and I do know with you're trying to keep your drink costs low, so you have wells versus more premium liquors that are on the back bar. And I think that bartenders get excited when you want to try something other than the well. And they're like, yeah, what would this rum taste like in a daiquiri? Let's, oh, that's awesome. You want to try that in an old fashioned, or you just want a pour of it to try it on its own? That's great. I mean, it is exciting for people to try that. But I mean, I don't know. I can't really comment on specific costs of our more kind of artisanal ingredients. There was a bar in San Francisco that was around for a long time in a few different iterations called Bar Agricole. And the bar owner, Thad Vogler, did a lot of work on this front in the early 2000s with his work at Bar Agricole, trying to just have a lot of grower-producer products and things that did not have synthetic chemicals, where he knew where they were coming from and that kind of thing. Just using ingredients and cocktails that were seasonal. Citrus doesn't grow year-round or in many parts of the country. So, what does it mean to not have a daiquiri at a time when limes don't grow? A little bit different in California, but it's interesting ideas to see how they work or don't work in practice.
It's pretty fascinating. I don't think of alcohol as seasonal at all. Obviously, at least the various garnishes are going to be seasonal in some cases, but if the whole point is preservation, so there is almost less seasonality to it. It's supposed to be around just forever.
Yeah, there's that. The sort of the farm to glass thing has been around in the Bay Area for a while, kind of looking at what is growing in season and try to incorporate it into a cocktail, whether that be a garnish or as an ingredient. But you are right with the preservation. That's why shrubs are around, because it was really a way of preserving a season. And so, yeah, it's interesting.
I see a lot more of that. I'll see bars or restaurants be like, okay, we make our own bitters, we make our own shrubs, various things like that. But I guess I haven't seen it too much beyond that. I guess I've seen eggnog places too. I also age my own eggnog. Every year I set one up for the following year.
Yeah.
It's so easy. I'm not like a brilliant chef, but I plan ahead, and I feel like time does most of the heavy lifting for me. But I think that's mostly what I see at restaurants and bars too, in that way.
Yeah, I feel like I do know people who age their eggnog. We've tried it before. I know that there are some eggnog competitions where bars will put it in a barrel and try it the next year. That one I think can be polarizing because of the perishableness of the ingredients, but and that's that. I mean, that also kind of lends itself to this conversation as well, is how comfortable are people with ingredients they're not so familiar with, or familiar with the scientific properties like eggnog, right? It's okay to drink it in a year if you've aged it properly, but a lot of people don't think that. So how do you change a consumer's mind about what's fun and interesting to drink?
I mean, I think just thinking about, honey is immortal because the sugar content's so high. Putting that much booze and that much sugar into dairy, at some point it just becomes I think it's good.
Absolutely, and you're completely right. It's safe to drink, but the perception is that it's perishable.
Yeah.
So it's changing, and I think with some of these lesser known, more artisanal products, is how do you get people interested and excited about things that they aren't familiar with, and they're not seeing billboards for, right?
I think probably it goes hand in hand with the growth of and acceptance of fermentation and fermented products too. I think people are increasingly comfortable with things. I remember as a kid, I had a close Korean friend. I remember he had a hard time growing up, and then now Koreans have seemingly conquered the world culturally with music, film, and food in a way where it's heavily dependent upon stuff that would have been considered stinky as hell when I was a kid.
I mean, living in the Bay Area, there's lots of. It's just fermentation, and yes, there's many places where you can get amazing banchan, and it's just, I think sometimes too it's a regional thing.
Yeah
It
could be. I've seen countless artisanal pickle places. I remember one time I walked across Brooklyn in an afternoon, and I was you're okay, this stuff's now everywhere. They seemingly can't get enough of fermented things. And cheese has been the one exception to that. That's always been somewhat popular, but I remember people making fun of stinkier cheeses as a kid too, and what even is the one I'm thinking of that I can't? Is it Limburg? What is it?
I'm not sure.
What is the
cheese?
No, it's a really runny, soft, aggressive, probably Norman cheese. I'm trying to remember what he. Anyways, there's cheese I remember that were jokes in kids' cartoons, and I feel like I hear less of that stuff now as an adult. I'm like, oh, actually, we're much more tolerant of these extreme fermented flavors than we ever have. Kombuchas everywhere, and
Right.
I wonder if we're just going to see more. Like, where's it going to be culturally in 10 years? Are we going to be comfortable with things that I don't even know about yet that are like,
Right.
this comes from Uganda and this is their fermented product, and now it's conquered the world as well?
I mean, that'd be great. It's how we learned about each other, right?
Do you know much about the ingredient sourcing for amari? Is it harder to find? Like,
Yeah,
stuff
so
like
it's
that?
interesting. And knowing that this was something you were thinking about, I did, amaro is not in the book, so I did look up a little bit of this. And I think part of this goes back to the fact that ingredients are not listed on bottles. So half the time, we don't know what the recipe is, or something like Fernet Branca, they'll tell you what's in it, but they won't give you the percentage. So there's that. I think sometimes knowing exactly what ingredients in there are, that can be very challenging because of the way things are regulated. And then I would say in terms of a lot of the common ingredients in amaro, there's interesting similarities between tea and the environmental impact with tea and the ingredients used in amaro because they're often similar. Yeah, and I was like, oh, let me look into this a little bit. There's a book called Botany at the Bar. It's called The Art and Science of Making Bitters, but they do have a passage in here about sourcing sustainable botanicals and kind of some of the things you should look for. It's not super in depth, but one of the things they mention is a conservation status. So looking as you're sourcing things, what's the conservation status, and then asking when you're sourcing botanicals, like where it came from, who harvested it, and how is it harvested. Some of the things like try to source cultivated botanicals from farms that use sustainable agricultural products, such as organic, biodynamic, and diversified farming. That's easier said than done. Like, how do you dig in and really know that? I get that question a lot of how you know that. I think asking questions is probably the best thing to do, but it is hard. Sometimes you can't go to the place where they're harvested to see it. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think one likely option is that if there are ingredients that are altitude dependent and those growing areas in the Alps shrink, I mean, they could probably go somewhere else. That's probably not great either. But I think the most likely option is they just become synthesized and are just recreated.
Yeah, and so looking at some of the similar issues that are facing the tea industry with like deforestation and pesticide use and water use, apparently that is causing lower yields, kind of like what you're saying. If the Alps are shrinking, there's going to be less available. Or they're planted in a way that they weren't always, it's not their ideal growing environment, so the quality decreases. And then I think, again, if you don't have to put ingredients on a bottle, you can use synthetic ingredients and no one is really going to know. So it's going to be interesting to see where this goes. Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
By the way, I just have to hang a lampshade on this since we both use it in different ways. There's something that's especially pretentious about saying amari and amaro. It's like it's not a martini, it's a martino. Like, kind of annoying comment. But, like, you're a bartender. If someone said that to you, would you just be like, get out of my bar? Like,
if somebody called it tried to use a pluralized martini, yeah, I would be like, oh wow, this, yeah. But I mean, amari and both are right, amaro and amari. So that does not faze me in the slightest.
Great. Now I don't know which direction to go. I'll conform to your standard for amaro. There's something about it where, because of the way that I conceptualize amaro, I think of it as so distinctly of a place and of a specific foodway tradition that the idea of making a new one just seems, it hurts my brain a little bit, but people surely are coming up with new combinations and making new amaro, right? Like, this does happen.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's also sort of there's a lot of things that go into it, and amaro has like, a defined somewhere in the spectrum of the flavor. Like, it there's a lot you can do in there. Whether you're using heavier on the rose or you're heavier on the bergamot or something. I mean, it really depends on what your recipe is. And I do think you're right. I think amaro can be one of those things that are very emblematic of place, like it, associated with Italy and that kind of thing. And they could be some, like Campari is an amaro, but Fernet's also an amaro, and so, where they live in that. And I think that there's a lot of room for interesting things. There's California amaros using more California botanicals. I think we're going to see some of that pop up a little bit. I think amaro I'd be curious. I did actually before this try to see what the global sales percentage was. And I found an article, oh man, where is it? It's like, Wine Enthusiast published it, and they were like, we did a Google search, and it said that amaro went up in popularity in 143% over the past 5 years. I was like, but you really don't have a source for that. You're just saying you Googled it. So I don't know. But with Brad Thomas Parsons' book, Bitters and Amaro, there's been attention to it and it's gotten more popular. And again, I live in San Francisco, and Fernet has always been a thing.
For its laxative use, right?
For some people, probably, yes.
I associate it most strongly with Argentina. I feel like they basically own Fernet Branca at this point.
Well, the two biggest areas for Fernet sales are San Francisco and in Argentina.
Wow.
So they're in conversation with each other. They're just drank in very different ways. Not with soda here, typically.
Do you think Malort is as toxic as it tastes?
It's all relative. I mean,
relative.
It's all relative.
I feel like all the time I've spent in Chicago, that was always the initiatory, okay, you got to try. But it was always kind of a gag.
Yeah. I was a bartender for so many years that I still have a bartender's palate where I like, and I'm not a super taster, so bitter does not bother me. I like bitter, so it wasn't like, but I am somebody who has had this stuff so like countless times. So I don't know. Malort doesn't really doesn't bother me as much as some people do. But yeah, I think it for sort of like the Chicagoan, like, can you hang with us? We're gonna pour you some Malort. Yeah.
One of the stories I liked from your book was about the protective status of tequila, where in designating the one variety, is it Weber?
Blue Weber.
Blue Weber. By designating that as ostensibly to protect the tequila industry, to make it secure, and this is what tequila is, it basically crowded out all of the weirder production. So it's one of those cases where the regulation probably sounded good, but it actually produced an unexpected second order result.
I'm not sure. I think in many cases that would be right. I think in this case it wasn't necessarily. I think some of the intention behind that was to crowd out.
Oh, you think it was just actively malicious in the way that they designated this?
Malicious, maybe is too strong of a word, but maybe a little nefarious.
Okay. Wow. A very, very careful wording here, but okay.
I also, because I'm not from Mexico, and there are things that I certainly do not understand about, like, the history and the culture and the politics and the economy. But from many things that I've heard from people who are much closer to it than I am, I think some of the intentionality behind that is questionable.
Interesting. Okay.
For precisely the reasons that you had just said about the secondary consequences, crowding out some of the stuff there. Some of the other products there.
I always love stories like this because on the surface, they sound good. The example that first comes to mind, maybe, I don't know if you've read this book or come across it. Do you know the book Peasants into Frenchmen?
No.
It talks about the Académie Française and various ways in which the French nation state, in creating an official language, basically crowded out like Gascon and Occitan and like other types of more regional dialects of French, and basically just in creating an official language, just kind of stamped all of that variety out. So in trying to protect something, we almost just made all of the rivals to it unprotected and especially vulnerable. And I wonder how many cases like that even happens still with foodways and alcohol.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and without having read the book, I think that that's a really interesting. I think that there are always unintended consequences that people might not even be thinking about. But I do think that that's why it's important when some of these things like, these making something official or big sweeping changes, talking to the smaller producers, talking to everybody, no matter where they sit, is really helpful to kind of understand the bigger picture of what some of those unintended consequences might be to make it more nuanced. I mean, that would take forever and things might not get done, but it would be a lot more intentional and take all of the stakeholders into account. Because with, in the example of losing regional dialect, I'm sure that there were people who kind of knew that might happen.
Oh, yeah. I think it would be hard to create the modern nation state without having a common language and a common culture in this way. So, it might just be part of the transition from the ancien regime and empire into the modern nation state. Maybe that is required for better or for worse. You can say that happened without having to necessarily have a judgment upon it, good or bad or somewhere in between. But yeah, I wonder how much that happens with foodways as well. I imagine there's probably examples of it where it totally saved everything to give this a special protected designated status. And there are probably also cases where it was a form of protectionism that was wielded against certain recalcitrant enemies of the cheese or of the wine in some way.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's like, well, that family on the other side of the valley, they've been making wine this other way, but we're closer to government. Well, screw them. We're going to.
Yeah, it's like, goes down to money and power.
Yeah, you can't be Nebbiolo. Nope, sorry. You don't get to be in this varietal. Sorry.
We can't call you Champagne because you're not from Champagne, France. I do think that there are people who are, one thing that I do want to say is that when people are thinking about sustainability, it's a spectrum and there's not one size fits all. And I think as long as people are trying and often, ideally trying their best, that does make a difference. The more you think about this and the more you ask questions, I think a lot of times it depends on how you're asking the question, but asking the questions and feeling like you can ask the questions, they should be asked. And that's how things change. No matter kind of where you are, where you sit, just asking questions. It's really important. But yeah, again, it's a spectrum and there's not a one size fits all approach. And also different spirit categories are so different. The environmental pressures and impacts and land management is going to be so different when you're looking at a pear tree or a wine vineyard or an agave field or a sugarcane farm. So it's just, it depends. And I think that there are lots of people who are thinking pretty deeply about this and really are doing their best and they can be models. And I think at least the people who are in my book like talking about this stuff and feel excited about it and are happy when the conversation turns more to this. And there's a lot more people that are doing some really cool things that are not in the book. Some I just didn't have room to include and some who I found out about after.
I don't know that I've asked many bartenders about this. Surprisingly, I'm not actually that big of a drinker, but I'm interested in the topic somehow.
Great.
But I mean, there's that famous Portlandia sketch of where did the chicken come from kind of thing, which I also associate that very strongly with Alice Waters and California food. That's where it comes from. But I can imagine asking a bartender that. I think in some ways I might get some eye rolls if I did that at the wrong bar.
I think it depends how you ask, right?
Yeah.
I think it depends how you ask.
Coach me. How should I ask this?
So I mentioned before, I'm an oral historian, and our famous answer when people ask questions about oral history is the answer is always it depends. And that's how I feel in this situation. If you're going into a dive bar where they're maybe
I ordered an old fashioned at one once, and it was like this probably the stupidest drink order I've ever made in my entire life. They're just like, it was.
Yeah, like if you're walking into a dive bar and you want a Negroni, don't ask if they have a Campari substitute, because if they're gonna like, kind of know where things are. But you could say like, "Can I have a local beer?" Like, what's your most local beer? That kind of thing. Okay. Or like, if I walk into a dive bar in San Francisco, like, hey, do you have any like whiskey that's made in California? Like something like that. If you walk into a cocktail bar that totes themselves as being sustainable and like artisanal craft kind of being part of all those conversations, I don't think that there's anything wrong with asking the bartender like, hey, I'm really interested in sustainability, and I would love to have something that was made locally or as locally as possible or with local ingredients. Like, do you have anything that you could make me, can you make me like trying to think of a good example here. Like, do you have a gin that's made locally? I'd really like a gin and tonic or something. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of something that's more basic and not like a paper plane or something, but.
What if you're 4 beers deep at PF Chang's at 2:00 on a Wednesday? I
would say maybe don't ask in that case then.
That was the silliest example.
But that's real, because people might feel like they're confident enough to ask at that point, and then I would say like, just while you're asking. And I also think putting your cards on the table, and it depends also on the volume of the bar. If you've gone into a PF Chang's on a Tuesday at 2 p.m. and you're the only person at the bar, yeah, you can ask questions. But if you're at a top 50 bar on a Friday night and you're like 2 people deep, maybe don't ask those questions then, right? I would also say at that point too, if you're interested in spirits, you can go to a retailer and ask those questions too, and kind of start from there. But, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking at a bar. Just be conscious of, how busy they are and how much time you're taking up, because it's hard when somebody wants to like really get nerdy with you when you're flying all over the place and it's a really busy night.
Yeah, when you're in the weeds, I can't imagine you want a question like that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, bartenders do pay attention to questions that guests are asking. Like if they're asking for something local, they're probably going to tell their manager or the owner or whoever's ordering the products for them, like, hey, we're getting a lot of requests for this thing. And there's power in those questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm sure enough people repeat that. I think they're going to want to make sure they have an answer at the very least, if not a product that they can sell the person asking for it.
Well, thank you for having me. This was fun to talk about.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Shanna. I'm really grateful. If you're listening, you enjoyed this conversation, A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits by Shanna Farrell. It's a really fun book. I learned a lot from it, and there's so much to it that we didn't even cover in this show, because how could we? She wrote a whole book about it, and that's longer than a podcast. But thanks so much for listening.